This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and I'm continuing with my Outlaws of Thunder Junction set review. I looked at all the multicolored and colorless cards already, and now we're looking at the white ones. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in Play Boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play Boosters in this set have a couple of different bonus sheets, not to mention special guests, and I'll cover those cards after we finish looking at the whole set. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some stuff. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description, where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the white cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. First up, we've got another round, which cost XX, 2 generic into white, and it's a rare sorcery. Exile any number of creatures you control, then return them to the battlefield under their owner's control, then repeat this process X more times. This is a cool card, but it's not good and limited. The idea is you can rebuy all of your creatures into the battlefield abilities, or give them pseudo vigilance, and if you have a bunch of other mana to sink into them, you can do it a bunch of times, but it just doesn't pan out that way very often in Limited. Most of the time, blinking your own creature, even blinking all of your creatures, doesn't matter or has an effect that isn't worth an entire card. And for that reason, I think you just have to give this an F. You know, an F doesn't mean this card will never do anything, but it means it will do things so infrequently that it'll hurt you a lot more than it'll help you. Next up, it's Archangel of Tithes, which costs 1 generic and 3 white for a mythic rare angel. It's got flying, and as long as it's untapped, creatures can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless their controller pays 1 generic for each of those creatures. And as long as it's attacking, creatures can't block unless their controller pays 1 generic for each of those creatures. This is a pretty spicy reprint, and it was a bomb last time. Making it harder for your opponent to do 2 things that happen all the time in Limited Magic is a good idea. Taxing those attacks and blocks means that the Archangel is great at slowing your opponent down when you need it to, and taxing blocks means she's great when you need to pressure your opponent too. That triple white is pretty intense, but you get a well-statted creature who wreaks havoc on your opponent, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Armored Armadillo, which for 1 white mana is a 0/4 Armadillo at common with Ward 1, and you can pay 3 generic and a white, and it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is its toughness. We've seen a lot of good 1-drops in Limited of late. This isn't one of them. A 1 mana 0/4 just isn't impactful enough, and while you can pump mana into it late so that it can do something other than be a mediocre blocker, it's too expensive and takes too long to get there. We just don't see activated abilities that cost this much to buff a creature work out these days. I think it's just a D. Next up, it's Avan Interruptor, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 2/2 bird rogue at rare. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the spell, you exile target spell, it becomes plotted. That means its owner may cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost. Spells your opponents cast from graveyards or from exile cost 2 generic more to cast. So your opponent will eventually get to cast the spell you exile with this, but it delays it by a turn, and they don't get to cast it entirely for free on a future turn either. They have to pay 2 generic, assuming the Interruptor's still around. And because they already paid for the spell anyway, you're both delaying it and charging them attacks while getting a reasonable flyer. And hating on plotted spells in the graveyard more broadly is also something worth doing in the format. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Bounding Felidar, which for 5 generic into white is a 4/7 cat beast mount at uncommon. When it attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control, and you gain 1 life for each of those creatures, and it has Saddle 2. This means you can tap any number of other creatures you control with total power 2 or more. This mount becomes saddled until end of turn, saddle only as a sorcery. So this is a pretty big deal when you saddle it. It'll make your attack way better and gain you life, which is a good way to shift a race wildly in your favor. The awkward thing is that if you do saddle this, it means you're attacking with 1 less creature, which makes it a little worse. The ideal thing is to play a new creature that couldn't attack and saddle it, in which case you don't feel like you're losing anything on your attack. It's expensive and the stat line is decent, but this will have a big impact on games where you manage to saddle it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bovine Intervention, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. Destroy target artifact or creature. Its controller creates a 2/2 White Ox creature token. Ah yes, the removal spell in the format that gives the opponent something back. These are always bad and limited. This is because casting this is worse than trading 1 for 1. People inevitably tell me I'm wrong when I give this kind of card in F. I'm sure there's someone typing in the comments right now about that, but every single one of them has panned out that way when we look at the data. It's cheap and somewhat flexible, but don't underestimate how bad it is to give your opponent something back. They're actually coming out ahead when you cast something like Bovine Intervention, and sure, you can use it on your own thing too, but that's not good either. It's an F. Next up, it's Bridled Big Horn. It's for 3 generic and a white is a 3/4 sheep mount at common. It's got Vigilance, and when it attacks while saddled, you create a 1/1 white sheep creature token, and it has Saddle too. A 4 mana 3/4 with Vigilance is probably a D+ or C- these days, and while the saddle trigger is nice, it doesn't actually make the Bighorn into a better attacker, and it doesn't add to your board in that big of a way. I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Claim Jumper, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 Rabbit Mercenary at rare. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you may search your library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then, if an opponent controls more lands than you, repeat this process once. If you search your library this way, shuffle. A 3 mana 3/3 Vigilance is a really good starting point, and if you went second in the game, you're likely to get a Plains out of the deal too. It's nice that if you're really far behind on mana, it can grab you 2 of them too. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Dust Animus, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/3 Spirit at rare. It's got Flying. If you control 5 or more untapped lands, Dust Animus enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters and a lifelink counter on it, and it is plot for 1 generic and a white. Alright, so a 2 mana 2/3 flyer is an easy B. And that's what you're going to do with this most of the time if you have it on turn 2. And then this has the crazy upside of later in the game, when you have the requisite lands it wants, you can plot it and then play it as a creature that is a game ender in most situations. It'll be a 4/5 with lifelink, and flying, of course. And the turn you play it, you're probably also adding something else to the board. So it really pays you off for taking that extra turn because you get such a big creature and one with lifelink that'll help you get back ahead from behind. It's just super efficient no matter when you play it. There are going to be games where you just play it on turn 2 and your opponent can never deal with it and then they die. And then there are going to be games where you play it after you plot it and your opponent can never kill it and then they die. I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Aret's Lullaby, which for 1 generic and a white is a common sorcery. Destroy target tapped creature, you gain 2 life. This kind of destroy tapped creature sorcery is usually close to a D+, because you usually have to take a hit from something first to kill it, and it's kind of like that Bovine Intervention spell where you kind of end up behind. It's not quite as bad as that because at least you do kill the creature, but your opponent got value out of that creature before you ever killed it. This makes up for that a little bit by gaining you back the life, and I do think that is relevant because you're going to gain back some of that life and then get to kill it, so I think it's probably a C. Next up, it's Final Showdown, which costs 1 white mana. It's a mythic rare instant, and it has Spree, which means you can choose 1 or more additional costs when you cast it. So you can pay 1 generic more, and all creatures lose all abilities until end of turn. You can pay an additional 1 generic more, and choose a creature you control against indestructible until end of turn, or you can pay 3 generic and 2 white more to destroy all creatures. So this, the ceiling on this is that it's basically Dune Blast. That is a 7 mana Wrath that lets you keep your best creature in play, which means you came out way, way behind. And by the way, this is also an instant, which is kind of insane. We don't see board sweepers at instant very often, but this is one. You can use it at the end of your opponent's turn, kill all of their stuff, and keep your best creature around. You do need to have 7 mana to do that, and up until you do reach that point, it's not like it's a useless card like most really expensive sweepers would be. You can use it to save one of your creatures from removal, which is sometimes worth doing in the early game. You can use it sort of as a combat trick to make your opponent's creatures lose their useful abilities that might be helping them in combat. That one's a little more of a corner case. But, the mode you really want is the instant speed, Wrath of God, keep my best creature, and destroy everything else. So, yeah, it's a late game Wrath that is basically going to end the game anytime you do manage to get to the 7 mana you need for it to be at its best. And then it has these other modes earlier in the game. There's no way this isn't a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Fortune, Loyal Steed, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/4 legendary beast mount at rare. When it enters, you scry 2. And whenever it attacks while saddled, at the end of combat, you exile it and up to 1 creature that's saddled at this turn. Then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. I'm already sold on a 3-mana 2/4 with Scry 2 on Enter the Battlefield. That's like an easy C. So the fact that this can also blink itself, and the thing that saddles it is pretty great, especially because that means you'll keep getting to Scry 2. So if you're also blinking something else that gives you value, it can be really insane. At worst, it kind of gives them both pseudo vigilance, and that's pretty nice too. So this has like a really good baseline and a very, very nice ceiling. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Frontier Seeker, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 uncommon human scout. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you can reveal a mount or a plains card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is going to draw you a card a huge chunk of the time in just any old white deck, and if you're in green-white, which is the most mount-focused color pair, it'll be even better, because if you get it like in the late game, there's a pretty good chance it grabs you an actual creature. In some decks, it's mostly going to hit a plains, which is still good, but obviously not quite as good. Either way, you're getting a 2-for-1 most of the time, and I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Getaway Glamour, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon instant with Spree. You can pay 1 generic extra to exile target non-token creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and you can also pay 2 to destroy target creature if no other creature has greater power. So we've already talked about how blink effects are frequently not very useful and limited, but that's when that's all a card does. So luckily, this has another mode that is removal. The times where you can blink your creature out of harm's way and kill an opposing creature are going to be great, and just paying 2 generic and a white to kill the highest power creature is pretty good. Keep in mind it checks all creatures, and if you happen to have the biggest creature, it won't work, unless you make sure to blink it, of course. I think this will work out efficiently enough and often enough to be a B-. Next up, it's High Noon, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, and you can pay 4 generic and a red, and it deals 5 damage to any target, and you sacrifice it. So you have to have access to red mana or this is unplayable. It just isn't worth having a symmetrical effect like this. It does work nicely against plot, but not well enough to get a big upgrade, especially because it'll hurt you too. That's why you also need this to be removal in the later game. If you can do that, it becomes a decent removal spell with Lava Axe upside. It's probably just a C overall, and an F if you have 0 red sources of mana. Next up, it's Holy Cow, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 Archangel at common with flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and scry 1. Once upon a time, 3 mana 2/2 flyers with nothing else going on were nice limited cards. Now you have to tack on 3 different upsides: flash, life gain, and scry. I feel like you get enough for your investment here for this to be a B-. Cards having flash is a big deal, especially in the blue-white deck where you can get some extra value out of it. Looks like a nice common overall. Next up, it's Inventive Wingsmith, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/4 Dwarf Artificer at common. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, and Inventive Wingsmith doesn't have a flying counter on it, put a flying counter on it. So the main way to give this a flying counter is to use the plot mechanic, but in the late game it can just randomly gain flying too because you don't cast a spell, and it also works well with flash like Holy Cow. You can pass your turn, leave your mana up, it'll gain flying, and then you still get to use your mana that turn just during your opponent's turn. And a 3 mana 2/4 isn't the worst starting point. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Lassoed by the Law, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until Lassoed by the Law leaves the battlefield. And when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token with tap. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This is basically a 4 mana 1/1 that exiles a non-land permanent, and that's a great card. This can hit pretty much everything while adding to the board. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Mystical Tether, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment. You can cast it as though it had flash if you pay 2 generic more to cast it. And when it enters the battlefield, you exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls until Mystical Tether leaves the battlefield. So we've got another Oblivion Ring effect here. Even without the flash upside, this would be a great common. This kind of card just does serious work in limited. Even with the downside, they can get destroyed later. So the fact you can also flash this in to potentially manufacture a blowout in the late game or trigger your cards that like it when you don't do anything on your turn is really, really good. Giving this a B. Next up, it's Nurturing Pixie, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 fairy rogue at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If a permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. A 1 mana 1/1 flyer on turn 1 is a decent play in a lot of decks, and this brings some real later game utility that lets you rebuy into the battlefield abilities, among other things. It also makes itself into a 2/2 flyer, which is way, way, way more relevant at that stage of the game than a 1/1 flyer is. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Omen Port Vigilante, which for 1 generic into white is a 2/2 human mercenary at uncommon, and it has double strike as long as you've committed a crime this turn. Targeting opponents, anything they control, and or cards in their graveyards is a crime. So this has an okay baseline, and giving it double strike on some turns is going to be a big problem for your opponent. You can even potentially do it at instant speed, so your opponent always has to have that in the back of their mind. Even just that threat of activation makes this 2-drop pretty nice, giving it a C+. Next up, it's One Last Job. For 2 generic and a white, it's a rare sorcery with Spree. You can pay 2 generic to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can pay 1 generic to return target mount or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And you can pay 1 generic to return target aura or equipment card from your graveyard to the battlefield, attached to a creature you control. So potentially you can spend 7 mana and get back 3 permanents from your graveyard. That's pretty sweet, but it is super particular about what permanents you can get back, and the baseline of each of these cards is not usually very good. 5 to reanimate a creature, no thanks. 4 to get a vehicle, no thanks. Or 4 to get an aura equipment, none of those move the needle. If you can get at least 2 permanents at a time back with this, it will feel good, and that seems possible, but it seems like it's going to take enough work that I'm not really that into this card, giving it a C. Next up, it's Outlaw Medic, which for 1 generic into white is a 1/3 human rogue at common. It's got lifelink, and when it dies, you draw a card. A 2-mana 1/3 with lifelink is a solid little body, especially early, and like all lifelinkers, putting equipment and counters on it is great, so the fact that it also replaces itself when it goes down is nice, especially because the black-white deck is going to be interested in sacrificing this guy. This looks pretty good to me overall. It's going to be a 2-drop you want in a lot of white decks, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Prairie Dog, which for 1 generic into white is a 2/2 squirrel at uncommon. It's got lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can pay 4 generic into white, and until end of turn, if you would put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, put that many +1/+1/+1 counters on it instead. A 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink is already a solid C, and this can grow quite easily in this format. In the late game, you can even sink mana into its ability so that it gets 2 counters each turn. Obviously, you're really only going to be doing that when you have nothing else to do, but that's not a small thing when you have a creature that's a lifelinker. It just gaining 2 counters a turn is a massive deal, because anytime it hits your opponent, it just creates a massive life swing between you and your opponent. I also love the art on this one, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Prosperity Tycoon, which for 3 generic into white is a 4/2 human noble at uncommon. When it enters, you create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token. Like all the mercenary tokens, it can tap to give target creature you control +1/+0. And you can pay 2 generic and sacrifice a token to give it indestructible until end of turn and tap it. A 4-mana 4/2 that makes a 1/1 is a card you pretty much always play, and this 4/2 also has the potential to gain indestructibility, and its power is high enough that that's not a small thing. Attacking with this is going to make your opponent groan more often than not, giving this a B. Next up, it's Requisition Raid, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon sorcery with Spree. You can pay 1 to destroy an artifact, 1 to destroy an enchantment, or 1 to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. This is one of the sweeter disenchant variants we've ever seen. I mean, it can do the disenchant thing, of course, but you can also potentially take out 2 permanents, or buff your whole board, or do all of them. Each of these effects is situational, but it's a ton of options on a cheap card, and when you can take advantage of more than 1 at a time, it'll feel truly backbreaking, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Rustler Rampage, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon instant with Spree. You can pay 1 to untap all creatures target player controls, and you can pay 1 so target creature gains double strike until end of turn. Untapping your stuff just isn't super exciting, but 2 mana for double strike is a good deal. Most creatures can win combat out of nowhere with it, and it has the potential to do lethal out of nowhere too, so tacking on this untap effect when it matters isn't too shabby, giving it a C. Next up, it's Shepherd of the Clouds, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/3 Pegasus at uncommon. It's got flying and vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand, and you return that card to the battlefield if you control a mount. A 5-mana 4/3 with flying and vigilance isn't great these days. I mean, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but anytime you're spending this much mana for that low of toughness, it means you're risking your opponent spending 2 mana to kill your 5-drop, and that's going to be a pretty common occurrence. But adding an Into the Battlefield ability to the mix helps offset that, because getting a small creature back in your hand gives you a 2-for-1, and obviously reanimating the creature directly to the battlefield is even better, and you'll be able to pull that off a decent chunk of the time. Format has a lot of mounts, including at common and especially in white. If it always reanimated a small creature, this would probably be a B+, but getting the card back in your hand is significantly worse. If it always did that, it would probably be a C or a C+. I think that means it's a B- overall. Next up, it's Sheriff of Safe Passage, which for 2 generic and a white is a 0/0 human knight at uncommon. It enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, plus an additional +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature you control. It has plot for 1 generic and a white. I don't like that this has a floor as a 3-mana 1/1 and a ceiling as a big vanilla creature. I mean, obviously, if it's big enough, you're getting a pretty good deal. And because it has plot, you can pay for it up front on an earlier turn where playing it just wouldn't be very impactful, and stash it away for later until you can play it on a turn where you do have a built-out board and it can be big. But again, the floor is ugly and the ceiling isn't that exciting, so I think this is just a C-. Next up, it's Stagecoach Security, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/5 human soldier at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn, and it is plot for 3 generic and a white. We've seen creatures that give +1/+1 and vigilance perform pretty well in the past. Adding vigilance to the mass pump is great because it means you don't have to give anything up on defense, and that makes this card's ability to contribute to a race far, far better because you're also going to do a ton of damage most of the time. The fact you can cast it with plot is pretty nice too, and you even get a bit of a discount in this case. Although most of the time, if you have the 5 mana when you draw this, you're just going to slam it on the battlefield. You'll really only be plotting this in situations where your board just isn't built out, or you really don't need to add the body right away. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Steer Clear, which for 1 white mana is a common instant. It deals 2 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and it does 4 damage to that creature instead if you controlled a mount as you cast this spell. Cheap removal is always hard to say no to because you can get such serious tempo. Obviously, this is conditional, and if you don't have a mount around, it can only kill the small stuff, but I think white is likely enough to have mounts around that this will perform reasonably well. It is a little awkward that it isn't great when you're aggressive because it doesn't keep something from blocking, so it's likely this is more useful in less aggressive decks, and the question is, are there going to be less aggressive decks that are that into mounts? Because that seems a little bit weird to me. I'm starting it out at a C. Next up, it's Sterling Keykeeper, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human mercenary at common. You can pay 2 generic and tap it, and tap target non-mount creature. Because mount can only be activated at sorcery speed, you can use this to keep one of your opponent's mounts from being saddled, potentially. Not being able to hit mounts is a definite bummer though, as tapping one after it gets saddled is pretty powerful. We've seen these Master Decoy type creatures really be less impressive as of late, but this has decent base stats and the ability certainly has utility, giving it a C. Next up, it's Sterling Supplier, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/4 bird soldier at common. It's got flying, and when it enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control. We've seen 5 mana 3/4 flyers that put a counter somewhere before, and they've always been pretty good. 5 mana to add 4/5 to the board, including this 3/4 flying body, is just a nice deal, and oftentimes the counter can drastically improve your attack the turn you play it. It's expensive, so I don't love taking them really highly or a bunch of them, but I like having the first one and valuing it at a C+. Next up, it's Take Up the Shield, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. This was a great trick the last time we saw it. In fact, it's probably one of the best tricks we've seen over the last few years, and that's not going to change here. The beauty of it is that it can blink both removal and allow pretty much any creature to win any combat, and the life you gain makes it an even bigger swing. The stats boost is permanent too. I'm giving this a C+. It has the potential to even reach into B territory, something that doesn't often happen with combat tricks. Next up, it's Thunder Lasso, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and when the equipped creature attacks, tap target creature defending player controls, and it equips for 2 generic. This equipping for free that first time will feel good, especially because it means you're not only augmenting a creature, but you're going to get in for a pretty darn good attack with your other creatures too, if you have them, since it can tap down your opponent's best blocker. Equipping it to other stuff later isn't a terrible deal either, as this kind of card really does create problems for your opponent. They have to account for the fact that they always have one less blocker. Still, it's certainly clunky after that first equip, so I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Trained Arinx, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 Cat Beast mount at common. When it attacks while saddled, it gains first strike until end of turn and you scry 1, and it has Saddle for 2. This is a solid 2-drop. You know, it's fine on turn 2, and then later in the game when you can saddle it, it's basically always going to be relevant as an attacker. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Vengeful Townsfolk, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 human citizen at common. Whenever one or more other creatures you control die, put a +1/+1 counter on Vengeful Townsfolk. Usually when they give us one of these creatures who grows when stuff dies, it isn't very good, because they usually give us something significantly below rate, like a 2-mana 1/1 or a 4-mana 3/3. Getting a 3-mana 3/3 as the baseline is, I think, a pretty big upgrade, as you'll never feel terrible about playing this on 3, and it has the same potential to grow. I'm giving it a C+. And our last white card is Wanted Griffin, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 Griffin at common. It's got flying, and when it dies, you create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token. 4-mana 2 toughness creatures really don't play well, because your opponent can usually deal with it for half the mana or less. But this does give you a 1/1 with some additional utility to help offset that problem. It would be way, way, way better if it made the token when it entered the battlefield than when it died, but it's still a solid card. I'm giving it a C. So those are all the white cards in Outlaws at Thunder Junction. Tomorrow I'll be back to look at all the blue ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on the parts of the set review that are already available, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.